So this is going to be more detailed about the toxicity so that people know what's what.
This lesson is on lead poisoning. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about where we might be exposed to lead. We're also going to talk about how lead causes toxicity. And then we're going to get into the signs and symptoms, how it's diagnosed, and how it's treated. So lead poisoning is also known as lead toxicity. It is a condition caused by increased concentrations of lead in the blood. Now, lead itself is a heavy metal. It's found in the environment. It's an environmental toxin, but it has no physiological function. However, when exposed to it, it can cause both reversible and irreversible health effects, depending on what stage of life you are in when you are exposed to lead and how long you are exposed to lead. We're going to talk a bit more about that in detail later on in this lesson. Now, it's important to note that no level of lead exposure is safe. Children are going to be most commonly affected, and adult males are more frequently affected than females. And we're going to talk a bit more about why that is in the next slide. So lead poisoning or lead toxicity can be broken down into acute and chronic forms. So acute lead poisoning is going to be most commonly caused by occupational exposure. So this is the reason why adult males are going to be more likely to be affected than adult females. Some occupations that increase the risk for exposure include any occupation or any job that exposes the individual to lead. These are going to include battery manufacturing and recycling, lead mining and refining, auto repair, and certain types of construction.
Thinking about all those people, especially predominantly a lot of men, that were working and installing those lines back then. Those telecommunication lines that were installed for us to be able to communicate with one another. Thinking, how many of those people got lead poisoning? And when that lead has been there, how long has that lead been in there? The entire time. Just think about that. Think about your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers that were probably working and installing those lines, and then they had health issues. And it actually contributed because of lead. Let's continue.
Now, there are other jobs or other occupations that can also increase your risk for being exposed to lead. If you want more information, please look up a list of those occupations. With regards to chronic forms, this is going to most commonly affect children. It's going to be insidious. It's going to be a slow exposure over time. And this is most commonly going to be from environmental sources. These are going to include leaded paint. So leaded paint has been phased out in much of the developed world. So this is going to be most important when being exposed to paint in houses built before 1978. And
remember when people used to make the joke of somebody that used to eat lead, you used to eat paint chips as a child? That's what they mean, right? Especially somebody that is perceived as quote unquote slow or, unintelligent. Somebody would be like, oh, you ate paint chips as a kid, didn't you? This is what they mean, because lead was in paint. And now we know that lead contributes to developmental disabilities within children, developmental disadvantages in children because of the ingesting of lead. And so that's what it means. So that's what that whole joke comes from. Just to let everybody know.
The paint itself is going to be more problematic in those older houses when that paint is peeling or chipping.
By the way, I have a sibling that was born before 1978. So it's not that long ago. I have a sibling. And many people's parents were born before 1978. So guess what? How many people's parents actually have a developmental disability that are adults now, but ate, or ingested, paint And sometimes it's not they're purposefully picking up a piece and then putting it in your mouth. There may be somebody that's like 1 or 2 years old, and they may see it on the windowsill or something like that. And the parents not watching, and it may be, and broken up really fine. And then they put their hand on there and they put their hand in your mouth. And then they just ingested lead. And the parents have no idea. How many times has that ever happened? How many of that paint, went into a fine powder, and maybe, just maybe, it got into the air and you inhaled it, or your child inhaled it. So these people that were, living in homes that were built before 1978, a lot of homes. Remember after the New Deal? Remember in the 1950s and 60s where you had this mass migration into the suburbs? Remember that? Think about it. Let's go.
And if there are very small children in those environments and they were to actually ingest that chipped paint, this is a possible way that they can be exposed to leaded paint. Another older source of lead comes from leaded gasoline. Gasoline used to have lead in it starting in the 1920s, and this has also been phased out as well. But during the time when there was lead in gasoline, the lead from the gasoline used to be sent out through the exhaust into the environment, into the air, and has essentially contaminated a lot of environments and some of the soil as well. So there can still be lead in certain areas from this leaded gasoline. And then
think about all those times back in the day where you'd be sitting in the car with the window open, and you smell maybe the fumes from the exhaust from the cars around you, and it was still lead in the gasoline. Imagine how many millions of people breathed in lead and it got into our systems. Imagine how many kids were riding on a school bus. By the way, just to anybody who's young, we didn't have air conditioning on school buses. So what did we do? We all had to put the windows down. We had to click, drop the window. Guess what? When we're riding to school or riding home from school, if before gas was unleaded, guess what? You were also breathing in those fumes to school and from school. And if you had developmental disabilities that were made from it, it was because you were ingesting the thing that was actually sabotaging you in your education. Boy, I tell you, this system.
Certain old toys, if children are playing with old toys, especially those that are painted with old paint that has lead in it, this is another source of exposure as well. So how does lead...
So let's move on to this part. So this is actually going to be interesting too.
The inhibition of glutathione. So glutathione is important in acting to neutralize reactive oxygen species. So lead will actually inhibit the process of glutathione usage, and it also inhibits the enzyme superoxide dismutase. Both of these effects lead to increased levels of reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Oxygen species then can lead to cell membrane damage. So all of these effects lead to a variety of signs and symptoms. So some of these are going to include hematological findings, gastrointestinal findings, neurological findings, and renal findings or effects on the kidney. So we're going to talk about all of these in the next upcoming slides. Let's first talk about hematological effects. So the hematological effect that's going to occur from lead poisoning is anemia. A microcytic anemia, meaning that the MCV, or the mean corpuscular volume, is less than 80. This essentially means that the average size of a red blood cell is small. So it's a microcytic anemia, or in dizziness as well. Now, there are
So it says signs and symptoms of anemia are fatigue, shortness of breath, or pallor. So pallor is basically means an unhealthy pale appearance. So people who turn pale, right? So let's go to the next one. Gastrointestinal.
nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and in some cases, constipation. The constipation is something that's going to be found in children. So abdominal.
If you've ever dealt with constipation in a child, you feel helpless. I mean, you really need to just. It's tough because you have a child crying. And what about us? Have you ever been constipated? It is not fun. Goodness gracious.
Abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea are more likely to be found in lead poisoning. And then there are particular neurological effects as well. These include irritability and being more aggressive than usual.
How many people are now just seem more irritable, more angry, more quick to anger, more snapping at you? Could it possibly be that the reason why we're also so angry is environmental factors, like how much lead is actually in our environment? Think about it. Think about why in the world we are also so quick to dismiss and get upset with other people, especially when it comes to wanting to change the system. Some people may believe that that they have the right answer, and then they completely just shut you off. Just think about it. Let's go.
Usual, decreased concentration, encephalopathy, so an altered mental status, so confusion. This is also termed lead encephalopathy, and rest drop can also.
So the part about encephalopathy, confusion, and think about how this affects us when it comes to regarding how we look at different groups, different disenfranchised groups, how we may start thinking about what some of these politicians tell us. They may say something like, oh, well, the people coming across the border are there to attack us, and we may be more susceptible to thinking less critically of what these politicians say. It's so many things that go into it. So many. Even how we process what people who are running our government tell us.
Occur. This is a neuropathy of the radial nerve. So this is radial neuropathy. So lead poisoning or lead toxicity can cause certain neuropathies, and one of them can lead to wrist drop. So the patient will not be able to raise the wrist. There are other neurological features I want to discuss here that occur in children. These include changes in activity level. So if there's a very young child that their activity levels begin to change, either an increase in their activity levels, hyperactivity, or a decrease in their activity levels, this can be a sign of lead poisoning. Behavioral changes in general. Developmental delay. This is going to be very important if there's some issue in development. So in very young children, following the developmental stages is going to be very important. And if there is developmental delay, along with some other findings we talked about before, this may be a sign of lead exposure or lead poisoning. And one other one as part of this is delayed language ability. So this is also going to play a role in this as well. And then school difficulties. If there are school difficulties, this can also tie in with the developmental delay. So
let's take a look at this for a second. Because a lot of us lately have been talking about hyperactivity and this different disorders. Could it possibly be that a massive generation of people have ingested lead and have led to hyperactivity? And some of us, and for some of us, it could be a lessening of activity, meaning that we're more lethargic. We may have chronic fatigue, right? Which may lead us to be less active, gain a lot more weight, become obese, right? Could it possibly be that's what happens? Could it be in behavioral changes that this actually has an effect on how we deal with one another in this country? Mind you, a lot of us millennials are 40. We're 40. We're old enough to run the country. And then developmental delays. Doesn't that affect how we are able to comprehend different aspects, different concepts? How many people have we met, especially on Twitter, that seem to lack reading comprehension? And then school difficulties. How many kids who especially are in poor neighborhoods that have difficulties in school and that were looked at as problem children? We're looked at as we need a special education, when in reality, was it just our genes and was it just our development, or was it something that was in our environment that caused us to be that way? This is literally affecting our children. And yet, companies like AT&T and Verizon do not want to take these out. Now, they're going to say, well, it's a safety issue if we take them out. You know, we don't know what it's going to do. And here's the thing. I'd rather them being taken out, and it might pose a safety risk, than leaving it in. Because leaving it in is constantly feeding into the negative health effects of all of us. That's like asking whether a medical team should extract the knife from the stab area versus just leaving it in. Yeah, until you get to the hospital, you have to leave it in just so that you won't bleed out. But once you get to the medical team, they're going to take it out, and then they're going to fix the wounded area so that it minimizes the damage. They took it out. They put it in years ago. They can definitely take it out, because it's going to affect us worse the longer it stays. And it's already been there for decades. So the question is, how much of your schooling where you felt like you were inadequate as a student was due to you being poisoned with lead? How much of your relationships have been affected because of you just being more irritable or having developmental delays, when really you thought it was just you, but really it was actually you were poisoned? Think about, like, this encompasses everything. And we think, oh, and maybe it's just us. When in reality, it's the corporations that don't give a shit about us. And they're allowing to have these chemicals in order for them to make as much profit. And then when we say, hey, you guys need to take this out, oh no, we don't need to take it out, it's not actually affecting you guys that bad. When in reality, it's been affecting us this entire time. Think about, look, when you look at all these different things that affect the kids, think about the boomers, think about Gen X, think about millennials, and now Gen Z. Think about all these people that were affected and probably have all these different symptoms. Think about the millions of us that had this affected to us. Think about it. Think about it. That's capitalism. It affects us even neurologically.
In summary, the neurological effects are oftentimes going to be separated by the central nervous system, which is going to be the brain and the spinal cord. This is going to be more likely to occur in children. So the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord is more likely to be affected by lead exposure in children. So a lot of those irritability, changes in activity level, behavioral changes, and developmental delay, it's all going to be more found in children. Whereas the effects on the peripheral nervous system, like the wrist drop that we talked about before, that neuropathy, is more likely to occur in adults.
And just think about these this lead exposure and it being probably closer to those of us who are working or working poor. And then let's say hypothetically you did find out. Well, do you have the insurance to fix this? Do you have the healthcare to actually mitigate this damage to your child or to yourself? How much is it going to cost? What are the co-pays? Have you been paying your premiums? See how this goes?
And serum lead levels are associated with changes in levels of aggression and IQ. So where there have been findings of average serum lead levels in different societies, different...
It affects your IQ, your ability to retain information, to problem solve, critical thinking. Wow.
Communities in different areas. If there is high serum lead levels, this is associated with levels of aggression. So if there's on average higher serum lead levels, there's often going to be an associated increase in aggression levels. And there's going to be an inverse relationship with IQ. So as the average serum lead level increases, there's oftentimes going to be a decrease in IQ levels. So that's also interesting to make note of as well. Now, there are other...
So this is how it affects humans and what is seen in it. Let me put this link in the chat so you guys can have that. It's also in the description as well, so you guys can have that too. But this is why it's so important for us to really get to a point where we have to change this system, because it's literally costing us our health. Literally.